Hey everyone, we're back with another roundup of a bunch of new features that have recently come to Final Cut Pro. So, what is there to talk about? Well, first off, Final Cut Pro for iPad. Yes, thank you. But just a quick rundown of what to expect on the Mac side of things when working with Final Cut Pro for iPad projects. Then the scene removal mask filter. Yes, thank you. Wait. Okay, yeah, so those things, the new auto color conform, logic filters, and much more. So let's go. What I want to look at in this video and when you can see here below or in the chapter list in the description if you want to just jump to what you are most interested in. But I suspect you'll miss a bunch of little tips and tricks along the way, which I can almost guarantee you haven't seen elsewhere. So first, I just want to quickly talk about what was also released with a recent update of Final Cut Pro for Mac OS. A version for iPad OS has, as some will say, finally been released as well. Well, at least for M1 and M2 iPads. But I don't want to get into the actual app on the iPad, but rather just give you some relevant information about it in the context of Final Cut for Mac. Again, including some tips that you probably have not heard about anywhere else yet. So let's jump in. First, and perhaps most importantly, unlike any other editing application for iPad or Mac, the version for iPad OS is 100% compatible with Final Cut Pro for Mac. This means that absolutely nothing will be lost in translation from your iPad to your Mac. Actually, iMovie for iPad and Mac is 100% compatible with Final Cut in the same way. Does it currently have full feature parity with Final Cut for Mac? No, but I'd say it's worth remembering that this is only version 1 at the moment. Importing and opening a project from Final Cut Pro for iPad in Final Cut Pro for Mac is nearly identical to how you would do it with an iMovie for iPad project. You can share wirelessly to a nearby Mac using AirDrop, or save the project to your iPad or iCloud Drive and retrieve it with your Mac. Which I've done here by saving the project that was very kindly sent to me by my friend Alex Gallner to my desktop folder. Now I can either open Final Cut Pro and choose File, Import, Final Cut Pro for iPad project, or simply double-click the project file. Either way you do it, Final Cut will first need to save the iPad project as a regular Final Cut for Mac library. Simply enter a name, go to where you want to save the new library, and click Save. With that, the project is converted to a Final Cut Pro library and appears in the library sidebar. I just want to point out a few unique features and media types that you might run into when dealing with iPad projects. While everything as far as titles, transitions, and generators will be replaced with their Mac counterpart and remain editable in every way that you would expect, there are a couple of effects that are currently unique to the iPad, or rather were only introduced for compatibility. For example, the iPad has its own color correction, or rather color adjustments filter that provides simple sliders for adjusting things such as exposure, contrast, brightness, saturation, etc. in your video clips. And while I've heard some people ask why this even exists, as if it were somehow meant as a replacement for curves or wheels, which it obviously isn't, it's there to ensure 100% compatibility with the iPad version of Final Cut, since this is the only color correction filter available for the iPad. Which, at least for now, makes perfect sense because curves and wheels would be far too fiddly to operate in a touch interface as opposed to simple sliders. Not everyone has a pencil. It was also designed for adjusting color specifically in HDR clips, considering that all compatible iPads both record and display HDR by default, but you can, of course, use it to adjust color in SDR clips as well. And if, for some reason, you find this way of adjusting your color easier or more practical than the colorboard, wheels, or curves, you now have it as an additional option in the pop-up menu at the top of the color inspector. Here you can also add an instance of the new color adjustments effect from the bottom of the menu. or from the color category in the filters browser, where you can add it to any clip in your timeline, as with all the other color correction filters. After applying it, or if it's already applied, you first want to make sure that it's set to the correct color range to ensure it's correcting the correct luminance range. This setting allows for the proper scaling of the sliders so that when you adjust the shadows, midtones, or highlights, they affect only those ranges in the image, whereby Final Cut Pro generally chooses the correct setting automatically for the clip it's applied to based on your project settings. And if the sliders are too fiddly for your liking, you can, as always, just scrub the values. I'd say the sliders are self-explanatory, so I won't explain them here. Aside from that, there is a nifty little live drawing tool that Final Cut for iPad has introduced, very much reminiscent of the Paint tool from Motion. With it, in Final Cut Pro on iPad, you can use live drawing to annotate clips with an Apple Pencil or your finger to create title sketches and line graphics. Your annotations are recorded as a live drawing clip, and when you play back the clip, your pencil or finger strokes are animated with a draw-on effect. After you import a live drawing clip into Final Cut Pro for Mac, you can't adjust the actual drawing itself, so not the line or the stroke attributes, but if you select it in the timeline and look in the inspector, you can see that you can adjust the speed of the draw-on animation. Final Cut Pro for iPad also has another unique feature that Final Cut Pro for Mac does not have. Yet? We'll see. It offers soundtracks that can dynamically adjust to fit the length of your project. This means you can change the soundtrack to any duration without the need for trimming, moving, nudging, or crossfading. The soundtrack automatically adjusts to fit the new duration. And while Final Cut for Mac does not have this feature, you can send the edited audio to your Mac, which will show up as just regular AAC files that you can use as any other audio, such as these various versions of the same soundtrack audio that are all based on the same original. So, what else is there worth talking about? Well, possibly the most noteworthy and one of my personal favorite new features is the new Scene Removal Mask filter, which you'll have gotten a small taste of in my intro. Anyone that has or has read up on the iPad app will have already seen that it too has the same filter. So what is it for and what does it do? Well, maybe you're familiar with FX Factory's Keyper plugin that came out a while back. The Scene Removal Mask is in principle the same thing, only it does more in some respects as well as a little less in others. In fact, I've heard some people actually say that the scene removal is worse than Keyper overall, which in my opinion is nonsense. Both have areas where they work great and others where they don't work at all. So there can only be a better depending on what you need. The cases where Final Cut's scene removal filter fails actually being far less. The scene removal mask detects objects in the foreground of a video clip via machine learning and other techniques and automatically removes the background without the need for a green screen. And the first thing that this does more than others is that it can recognize a near unlimited variety of objects, not just humans, as you can see in these examples that I'll get into in a second. So while tools such as Keyper have their advantages and aren't rendered entirely obsolete, it's limited to recognizing and masking only humans at this point. By the way, you can find the scene removal mask in the now new mask and keying category, into which all masks and keying filters have been merged. On a side note, the keyer has now been renamed to Greenscreen keyer, and together with the Luma keyer has been optimized, meaning made compatible with HDR material as well, but they haven't changed otherwise. In fact, I never actually realized that either weren't HDR compatible until now. And there is a new corner mask filter, which gives you a simple 4-corner mask so you don't have to draw your own with the draw mask filter, should you, for example, just need a quick and simple garbage mask for a key or mat. Nothing spectacular, just a nice convenience. So for best results, before you apply the scene removal mask, Apple recommends making sure the clip has a static background and was also captured using a static camera, in other words, a camera on a tripod, for example. Which is, in fact, the first and probably biggest difference compared to Keyper, for example, which lets you use the effect on a moving camera as well. The next thing you have to watch for is that you have a few extra frames at the beginning or end of your clip showing the background without the foreground subject present. In other words, you need what is called a clean plate for reference. Again, one of the differences to Keyper. Your subject should also have been shot in a bright, evenly lit place, preferably indoors to avoid harsh shadows. It should also have good contrast between the subject and the background. In other words, no similar colors or textures for, I'd say, obvious reasons. It should also not have any strong moving shadows and should have a fair amount of space between the foreground subject and background. The background should also be as visually simple as possible, so you'll want to avoid complex patterns. Basically, the less guessing the effect has to do to differentiate between foreground and background, the better the results will be. But as super limiting as all this sounds, again, these are recommendations and best case scenarios, and you'll see in a moment that these are much more flexible than you might initially think. So how do you use it? Well, as usual, in typical, super simple Apple fashion. I'll start with an intentionally less than ideal example, one that pretty much does not adhere to any of the best practices recommended by Apple, except maybe the fact that the camera is stationary. A clip of my dog Peanut and myself that I intentionally recorded in front of a very busy background, and I walked out of frame at the end to get the needed clean plate. Now from the new mask and keying category, apply the scene removal mask effect by double-clicking or simply dragging it to the clip. And we can see the result is not exactly as expected. But that actually has to do with the default setting of the filter, because by default, the reference is set to the first frame of the clip. And as I said, I walked out at the end. So clicking on the reference pop-up, we can see that I have 4 different options. Reference the first frame as it is now, or reference a frame 1 second into the clip, 1 second before the end of the clip, or simply the last frame of the clip. By the way, the little question mark to the right here will list the best practices tips for you as well, should you have forgotten them. And since I walked out a couple seconds before the end, I could use either of the last 2. After selecting either, we can see that although the clip is far from ideal, the results are surprisingly good. And mind you, my dog is also masked almost perfectly. Like I said before, something that other tools such as Keyper are not able to recognize. And we'll see in a moment that it goes beyond even that. Due to the less than ideal contrast in the background, there is a lot of what is called boiling edges. So fluttering along the alpha channel. But I actually have a nice way of cleaning this up a bit, which I'll get to in just a second. So assuming I actually intended to cut the 2 of us out and replace the background, it would have helped to pay better attention to the aforementioned rules. Final Cut is using the reference frame to first create what could very roughly be compared to what's called a difference mat, and then uses machine learning to differentiate between foreground and background even more precisely. But mind you, an actual difference mat would not get anywhere close to this result. Because, believe me, I've tried it. But instead of just cutting us out of the background, I can use the scene removal for color correction, for example, of just the foreground or background. For that, I can either simply duplicate the clip on top of itself and remove the mask from the lower clip and adjust each separately. Or, what I think works better in many cases, I can undo that and skim to the empty frame at the end of the clip, press Shift F to match frame to the event clip, and now simply hit Option F to generate a freeze frame at the playhead. This I can then drag below the masked clip. Now I could, for example, apply a blur filter to the background. Adjust it to my liking. And now open the color board with Command 6 and desaturate it to make it black and white, and even drop its brightness down a bit if I wanted to. All of which without affecting the foreground, allowing me to nicely accentuate it. And doing this actually also hides the boiling edges quite well. Certainly enough not to be useless, and even without a little cleanup trick that, again, I'll get to in a second. I actually went out and recorded a bunch of random footage to see what works in general and what doesn't. And to be honest, if the camera is stationary and you have a reference frame, there's very little that can't be masked to some degree, which I find very impressive. So let's look at some other examples and see what we can do with them. Next up, just to show you what potential this filter has, I recorded different scenarios with mostly anything but people in them. For example, I recorded a few seconds of a nearby street with passing cars, starting of course with no cars. With the scene removal applied, you can see that the individual cars are recognized and masked out. Amazingly, even the pedestrians way on the other side of the street that I hadn't even noticed before are recognized. Even if the edge boiling is far more prominent than in the first example. But again, if I actually intended on getting a cleaner matte of the cars, I'd have to pay much better attention to the criteria that Apple recommends. But I can actually use this to once again duplicate the clip on top of itself, remove the effect from the bottom clip, and now apply an effect to the top clip. For example, the flashing effect. And with that, I get an interesting effect that has some fun potential once played back. Other objects that can easily be masked, which oddly I have not seen anyone else actually show or mention, are, for example, animals, this time by themselves. Here I simply recorded my dog Peanut on my sofa and had her move out of the frame. Once I apply the scene removal filter, bingo, not bad, considering once again the less than ideal background conditions. The red in the background being similar to her fur and the cushion being nearly the same color as her paws. And if I stop somewhere in the middle, we can see that there is also some red fringe coming through from the background in the motion blur. But I can temporarily disable the scene removal, go into the color inspector once again, apply a hue saturation curves filter, use the eyedropper next to the hue versus sat curve, and drag out a selection for a range of the red in the background. Now, I simply drag the middle control point of the 3 that have now appeared on my curve down to desaturate just the red. Adjust it as needed to not include the color of Peanut's fur, and return to the video inspector. Now, if I reactivate the scene removal, we can see the red fringe has disappeared. In fact, if I drag the color filter to the top of the effects stack, we can see that the mask is even a little better than before, since the scene removal filter is less confused as to what is sofa and what is dog. And just for comparison, if I disable the Final Cut filter and apply Keyper to this clip, you can quickly see where the differences lie. There is effectively no masking whatsoever applied, since Peanut isn't even recognized. And while the provided sliders for refining the matte are generally definitely useful, in this case they're pretty useless. So much for it in this particular case somehow being better. Removing it and re-enabling the scene removal, I can now, for example, add one of the all-new dynamic backgrounds underneath the clip that have also been added to Final Cut version 10.6.6. Say, for example, the Doppler background. And to top it all off, I could also add the drop shadow effect from the stylized category to give the whole thing some depth. Adjust it to my liking, and then maybe even one of the comic looks to top it all off. So, as you can see, the filter opens up quite a few new creative options with just a few clicks. So here another quick example. I went to a skate park across the street from me and shot some random footage of kids skating and scootering around. Again, anything but a simple background, but with the scene removal applied, I'm able to isolate a kid on his scooter to an astonishing degree given the circumstances. And while the strong moving harsh shadows that Apple in fact recommends against in their best practice guidelines are making for flutter here and there on the ground, I could always use 90+% of it and manually mask the one or other frame to get it to 100% if I need it, still saving me a lot of time. Then I was curious how the scene removal deals with depth of field. So when an object, in this case my buddy Kai, is out of focus and steps into focus, again with anything but a simple background. He walks from the side into frame, then into focus. Activating the scene removal, we can see it works surprisingly well, if not perfect, even when he's out of focus. Something that would probably improve a lot with a more suited background. Again, comparing it with Keyper, we can see that it has a much harder time isolating Chi. It also has much more trouble recognizing the phone and even his arms at times. Even when switched to high quality and playing with the parameters, for example the thicken, there's little chance of recovering it. And speaking of sliders and refining the matte, if you're missing some basic adjustments for fine-tuning the matte in Final Cut's scene removal, I've got you covered. I've thrown together a simple and quick filter that I've called SRM Editor, based in part on Motion's Magic Matte filter that gives you some of those basic adjustments, mainly for edge control and alpha level adjustments. Best used with the viewer set to show only the alpha channel to tighten the matte, or to remove a little edge you might have with the shrink slider or gamma, etc. I'll put a link to the filter in the description where you can download it for absolutely free if you like. Then I thought I'd try and see what it thinks of other random objects. In this case, some candles I had sitting on my table that I moved away, then moved into frame and applied the scene removal mask. Et voila! Even the flickering flame was perfectly masked. Of course, the reflective part of the star-shaped candle holder and the almost identical color of the back candle with the table made for some obvious fluttering. But then something like that would even be a pain to deal with if it were a green screen, so I find that easily excusable. That could be alleviated by simply adding some draw masks around that area as needed. So, does this somehow replace a well-done green screen? Of course not, nor is it intended to, whereby I recorded myself in front of a regular, again, intentionally busy background, as well as in front of a green screen, which really represents any high-contrast, monochromatic background that you might have, with a glass, so as to test what happens to any transparency. And I have to say that I was actually pretty surprised. First, this is me in front of just the regular background with Final Cut scene removal. Obviously, I wouldn't want a glass of wine that looks like it was topped off with some dirt or smoke. But that same shot in front of a green screen, again, which represents really any monochromatic background you may have, you actually get a surprising amount of transparency. Of course, compared to even this quick and dirty key, a lot more of the glass is missing, which handles the transparency much better overall. But still, I'm quite surprised at how well it works with Final Cut scene removal. I wouldn't actually have expected any sort of transparency or even that much of the wine glass to be retained. And again, looking at the same clips with Keyper applied, the results of the scene removal mask are actually even amazing in comparison, since Keyper, of course, doesn't take the glass into account at all. Even with this static camera, it doesn't even do all that well with me either, and it flutters even worse with both the regular and the green screen version, no matter how much I fiddle with the options and sliders. Which actually really surprised me. So yeah, I'm not sure how some can claim this to be the better alternative overall. But to be fair, if you have a shot such as these of humans where the camera is moving and no clean plate for reference, then Keyper is without a doubt the way to go, as the scene removal mask will not be able to deliver anything useful. This is the thing Keyper is made for, and it does it very well. But even with static footage where no explicit clean plate was recorded, I tried a little trick. In this case, an older clip of mine where the clean plate wasn't actually at either the beginning or end, but rather somewhere in the middle. I simply hit Shift F at the position of the clean frame to match it to the event clip, then Option F to create a freeze frame in the timeline. I copied the still and moved it in front of the clip and made a compound clip of the two using Option G. Applying the scene removal filter to this clip and pasting the copied still below the compound gave me the result I wanted for a clip that was technically unsuitable. This way I could finally simulate, for example, my various levels of coffee consumption by applying the earthquake filter and turning up these settings as needed. Next up is the new color conform feature, and as complicated as everything behind this may seem, as simple is Apple's solution to make it work, and is a huge step forward when it comes to working with footage that lives in different color spaces. In other words, they have come up with a great new way to deal with all the different color spaces that we are already working with or will be working with more and more as time goes by. Easily the most common problem and most confusion I've seen that this new feature solves perfectly is when people imported HDR footage that they had shot, usually unknowingly, on their new iPhone, and it shows up in their timeline completely overexposed, like this clip. This happened, at least until now, because they were editing an HDR, or high dynamic range clip, into an SDR, or standard dynamic range timeline. The issue is that SDR, also known as standard gamut material, not only has a lower color resolution, namely 8-bit and not 10-bit color as HDR does, but more importantly, HDR also supports much higher peak brightness, which is measured in nits. While SDR material will have a nominal maximum brightness of 100 nits, HDR will generally be around 1000 to maybe 1500 nits, whereby, at least theoretically, HDR can represent luminances as high as 10,000 nits, though I don't know of any display that can get anywhere near that. SDR TVs will only go to 100 nits, and the vast majority of computer screens will go to 250 to maybe 400 nits, 600 nits if you're lucky, and it was much more expensive. So simply put, the clips are perfectly fine, only they are displaying a higher level of brightness or dynamic range than the screen could display and needed to be adjusted accordingly. So what was and is the solution? Well, until 10.6.6, you would drop the clip into your timeline and then needed to restrict the clip's dynamic range to make it suitable for viewing on an SDR display. This process is called tone mapping. That was done correctly with the HDR tools filter, not, as some very incorrectly recommended, by overriding the clip's color space via its settings panel. At least not if you wanted it to actually look exactly as it was recorded. With the HDR tools applied, you then simply set it to tone map, in the case of an iPhone clip, the HLG color space to SDR Rec 709. And bingo, you are good to go. You can, of course, still convert a clip's color space using the HDR tools effect, but it's now a legacy effect only still included for backwards compatibility with older projects. So yeah, that was all a bit complicated and confusing. People just want to edit, and that's where the new color conform comes in. If you look in the Final Cut Pro settings under the General tab, you'll notice that a new checkbox has been added at the bottom. HDR Automatic Color Conform, which will be active by default. The effect of this setting is twofold. First off, when it's enabled, Final Cut Pro manages color space settings automatically, so you can easily edit HDR and SDR clips in the same project, or even mix different types of HDR together. If I select any given clip in my event, you can see the new color conform settings for it at the bottom of the video inspector, and by default, the color conform is set to automatic. This means that if you add a clip to a project that is set to a different color space, the clip's color space is automatically converted to that of the project. Both here and later in the timeline, you can also use the color conform to manually adjust how an individual clip is conformed, no matter which color space a project is set to that you use it in. For example, to a specific conversion, such as HDR HLG to SDR for HLG clips that you add to an SDR project. Should, for some reason, the automatic conform not be working and you don't want to have to set it every time you use the clip, which could, for example, happen if the clip's color space metadata is missing or somehow incorrect. This clip of my dog, for example, is an HDR clip from an iPhone in HLG, as you can see in the information window of the inspector. Let's drop it into each of these projects, each set to a different color space. An SDR project, an HDR HLG, and an HDR PQ project. If I drop it into the SDR project, as opposed to it, as it has been until now, being completely overexposed, it looks exactly as it should. If I select the clip and go to the inspector down to its color conform settings, we'll see that that's because the autoconform has set the tone mapping to HLG to SDR. Again, something up until 10.6.6 I would have had to do manually via the HDR tools filter. Opening the project set to HLG and appending the same clip with the E key, again, it looks exactly as it should. Once again, if I select it and go to the inspector down to its color conform settings, we'll see that the autoconform has set the tone mapping to none, as it should be. And last but not least, appending it into the HDR PQ project and checking its conforming settings, we see it has been set to, of course, HLG to PQ. Even if I hit Command J to go into my project settings and switch this from PQ to HLG, going back to the clip, we see that the autoconform has switched to none, since it does not need any tone mapping anymore. Very cool. And of course, the flip side of the coin, if you ever edited SDR footage into an HDR project, you'll have noticed the opposite. The footage showed up too dark, as we can see with this SDR clip with the auto-conforming turned off. Here, too, the color conform comes to the rescue. With it turned on, appending an SDR clip into my HLG project and then checking its settings reveals it has been set to SDR to HLG, but by default it sets the 100% SDR white level to a 75% HLG signal level. That means anything that was at 100 IRE in SDR is now at 75%, as the scopes will tell me under Command 7. If you want it at 100% of the HLG signal level, you can always just set the conform to manual and switch it over. And for all the HDR tech nerds out there, if you are in a PQ project, it will default to setting the 100% SDR white levels to a 58% or 203 nits PQ signal level. If you want or need it higher, you can switch it to manual once again and adjust the peak brightness via this slider if you, for example, want it to go to 1000 or even more nits. The other, less obvious feature of the automatic color conforming relates to libraries. When you, as I have here, create a new library, it has always been, and still is, set to standard gamut color processing by default, meaning to the SDR color space. Working in SDR is, of course, perfectly fine, since the vast majority of screens are only able to display SDR anyway. And until now, you'd have to manually go into the library settings at some point and manually switch it to wide gamut if you wanted to edit your project in HDR. But no more. Now, with the new color conforming, if the very first media you import into the event, either via drag and drop or even via the import window, is HDR, you'll be asked if you would like to switch the library to HDR, which in turn lets you create HDR projects matching the imported HDR clips. If you in fact know you want or need to export your project in HDR in the end, you can simply click Switch to HDR, and the library is switched to wide gamut for you. Otherwise, you simply click Keep as Standard SDR to ensure your clips are correctly tone mapped for your subsequent SDR output. I'll switch it to HDR. Now, if I create a project from my HDR media and check the automatic settings, I can see the project is automatically set to 2020 HLG as my clip is. Very helpful. Some of the things that the color conform doesn't always auto-conform correctly, though, are older titles, transitions, generators, and effects. At least not at the time of the making of this video, so this may change in the future. I'll show you what I mean in the context of titles, whereby the process is basically the same for the rest as well. While, as far as I can see, all the standard Final Cut Pro titles have been adjusted to auto-conform, third-party titles that were created before 10.6.6, possibly even many after that, will not auto-conform. For example, this title from Motion VFX, the, in my opinion, by far best template and plugin maker for Final Cut Pro, shows up noticeably too dark in my HDR project once connected. If I deactivate the underlying clip with the V key and open the scopes again with Command 7, we can see the supposedly white type in the title is not actually white anymore, but rather gray. So the exact same effect we saw with SDR clips in an HDR project. The luminance levels are too low. Looking at the title's color conform settings, we can see it's set to none. I'm not entirely sure why these are not recognized as being in the SDR color space, since, as we'll see in a moment, that's in fact what color space they're set to. So to get these to actual white, or rather the correct luminance levels, there are two options. The first anyone can do, and that is to simply set the color conform pop-up of the title to manual, and in this case choose either SDR to 75 or 100% HLG, just as we did with the SDR clips. And bingo, my title's luminance is adjusted as needed. The only problem is that if I reactivate the underlying clip again with the V key, we can see the obvious problem is that most, if not all, titles are built in a way that they also affect anything below them, as in this case. Now the clip is completely overexposed. So if the upcoming second option that involves using motion isn't something you can or want to do, then in a case like this, you'll need to make a compound clip of the title with option G, give it a name if you want, and click OK. Now the title has the correct luminance without being able to affect the clip below it. The second option is for anyone who owns Motion 1064 or newer and doesn't care to have to go through the whole selection and switch and compounding song and dance every time they use a title they might use more often. This procedure is also super simple. You simply right-click the title whose color processing you'd like to adjust and choose Open in Motion, or Open Copy in Motion if it's a standard Final Cut title, but as I've said, they shouldn't be affected from what I can tell. Once open, all you need to do is select the project layer at the top of the Layers window, then go to the inspector, select the Properties tab, and here next to Color Processing, you should see that it's set to Standard Gamut SDR. Here, you simply click the pop-up menu and set it to Automatic. You're told that changing the gamut may cause colors to shift, which I'm technically not actually doing at this point. You can just go ahead and click OK. Now you just need to go back to the properties and you'll see that a slider for the HDR white levels has appeared. By default, it's set to 75%, but you can set it to 95%, for example. The same as every standard Final Cut title template, or even 100% if you like, and have a display with which you can enjoy that level of searing brightness, such as an Apple XDR display. Or set it to whatever and publish the slider so the user can decide for themselves. Now all you have to do is hit Command S to save it. You're told that you can either save it as a duplicate, so effectively as a copy of the original, should you want to keep the current SDR-only version to use it in older versions of Motion and Final Cut Pro, for example, or save the original, effectively replacing it. I'll choose original. With that, I can switch back to Final Cut Pro and back to my titles browser. I select it again and hit Q to connect it to my timeline. Skimming over it in the timeline and looking at the scopes, we can see that now, without any further adjustments, it looks just as it should, even though the color conform settings are still set to none. Rinse and repeat for any and all titles, generators, transitions, or effects that are not showing up as expected in your HDR projects and that you would like to adjust. Last but not least, a quick speed round of what else was added to Final Cut Pro 1066. Okay, so there are also new color presets. Until now, we were only given color grading presets in the form of filters in the Looks category in the effects browser. And while these may have been okay to get a quick base look going, the biggest caveat was and is that they only have very little customization options outside of maybe a few simple sliders. In some cases, even just a single amount slider. So actually not really helpful at all. But now we have both color board and color grading presets as categories in the effects browser. The color board presets are exactly that. Color board presets are based on the regular color board effect. After applying any one of them and looking in the clip's color inspector, you'll see that it applies a regular color board filter that has been adjusted accordingly to get you going in a desired direction. And since it's a regular color board correction, I can, as opposed to the looks filters, simply adjust it any and every way I like. Nice. The color grading presets, on the other hand, are effectively the exact same thing, only they are based on the color adjustments effect, which is applied to my clip. That way, these also are 100% Final Cut Pro for iPad compatible, since these are available there too. And if you ask me, there are a few very useful ones amongst them both. As I already mentioned in the one scene removal mask example, Apple has included a lot of new dynamic content such as the dynamic background generators. In this case, a variety of 12 really nice animated backgrounds over which you can superimpose titles or keying effects, for example. All of them can be extended to any desired length and will, of course, loop perfectly. And while unfortunately none have any parameters published that you can edit, if you like a certain generator but need it in a different color scheme, I would suggest simply using the Colorize filter and adjusting it as needed. Then there are also new dynamic titles in the Titles browser under the same name. Here you'll find all of 38 new titles in 7 different categories. Anything from full screen titles to bumpers and lower thirds. These, on the other hand, have the most essential parameters published, such as the colors used in the title for editing any way you need. And if you've decided to use a certain category of titles in your project, you can complement them perfectly with one of these 7 new dynamic transitions, each of which is named after which category of title they go with stylistically. A new category of essential titles has also been added that contains a relatively basic but still very useful set of titles, all of which actually have some nice options to customize the type and speed of their animations. The seemingly basic essential title, for example, has all of 11 possible animations to choose from. Going back to the generators, there are also 12 new pattern backgrounds. Basically, different wave patterns, which of course can be looped seamlessly as well. And unlike the dynamic backgrounds, these at least have basic editing options as far as their color schemes are concerned. And just above these, in the generator sidebar, you'll also find a new objects category, which gives you 5 basic, short, animated generators that are social media oriented. So, simple like and click style elements that you could, for example, use to build your own like and subscribe type callout titles. New logic effects for audio have also been added, which is always a good thing. There are various new filters, and just to name a few, there's Chromaverb, which features 14 discrete room type algorithms. It's a very unique filter for reverb creation. It's based on the principle of a circular structure in which the sound is gradually absorbed. So if reverb is something you need, I really recommend you check this out. It has some very impressive sounding presets and also a ton of room types that are just fun to play around with. Oh, and it also is pretty cool looking. Then there's the less spectacular looking DSR2, which is a fast-acting dynamics compressor designed to isolate and attenuate a particular band of high frequencies in an audio signal. You can use it to reduce unwanted sibilance, meaning harsh S and T sounds that many will have had caused by microphone positioning, the voice-over delivery, or compression and saturation effects on the audio. And finally, the Vintage Tube EQ filter, which is really only for music or instruments, and it emulates 2 retro EQ units that were often paired in the analog world as they complemented each other very well. So certain retro fans should really appreciate this one. And for all you ProRes RAW fans out there, Apple has added a brand new window for accessing ProRes RAW settings, similar to the one that has long been available for Red RAW footage. But not only that, Best of all, they've added a new API that allows camera OEMs to provide a plugin to work even better with ProRes RAW video files shot with their cameras. As of this recording, Canon is the only manufacturer I know of that has released such a plugin. So if you have a ProRes RAW capable Canon camera, you'll want to head over to their site and download it. I've included the link in the description. And I'm sure there will be many more from Nikon, Sony, and others. Once you have a ProRes RAW clip selected in the timeline, simply go to the Clips Information Inspector and click the Modify ProRes RAW Settings button at the bottom. This will open the new RAW settings window, which now also gives you access to the default RAW processing settings built into Final Cut Pro, rather than in the Clips Information panel as I showed in a previous video on working with ProRes RAW files. Here you can adjust the ISO setting, exposure offset, and more depending on the camera and version of the Atomos recorder you used. But if you, like me, have installed a plugin from the camera manufacturer with which you shot the ProRes RAW footage, you can now adjust the RAW camera settings optimized specifically for that manufacturer's camera sensors. I simply select the clip in the timeline, click the Process Using pop-up menu, and select the camera manufacturer specific processing that has now become active. This clip, by the way, was shot with an R5C in 8K, kindly provided to me by Mr. Stuart Morgan, link to his work in the description. In this case, you can see that as soon as I switch the processing to Canon's plugin, I get additional sliders for noise reduction and sharpness, because in the case of Canon, the plugin not only allows you to adjust ISO and custom white balance as before, but also, depending on the camera used, noise reduction, sharpness, and in some cases even lens distortion correction, and more if shot on an EOS R5, R5C, or R6 Mark II, for example. Even the tone mapping of the clip changes ever so slightly according to Canon's own color signs. So if you have a compatible camera and the plugin, grab it and let me know what you think in the comments. So there we go. A couple of big ones and a bunch of little stuff. My favorites being the scene removal mask and color conforming, but what are your thoughts? Would love to hear from you down in the comments. And while you're down there, if any of this helped, you learned something, and you liked what you saw, it would really help the channel if you gave us a like and maybe even hit the subscribe button to catch future content like this. Thank you so much for watching.